Somewhere right now, a farmer in rural Vietnam is pushing 4 matchsticks into the soil around his chili plant. No fertilizer bag, no pH meter, no subscription to an agrochemical company's loyalty program. Just 4 matchsticks and a knowledge that has been quietly passed down through generations. A knowledge that a multi-billion-dollar industry would very much prefer you never find out about. And his chilies? Hotter, fuller, and more abundant than anything grown with the expensive stuff. I know what you're thinking. Matchsticks. Seriously? This sounds like something your grandmother made up. And that reaction, that instinctive dismissal, is exactly what $58 billion worth of marketing has trained you to feel. Because the moment you start trusting a 2-cent matchstick over a $12 bottle of specialty fertilizer, the whole system starts to crack. Here is what nobody in the gardening industry will tell you on camera. The sulfur compound packed into the head of a standard matchstick interacts with soil chemistry in a way that directly triggers capsaicin synthesis in chili plants. That means more heat, more yield, more flavor, for less than the cost of a single stick of gum per plant per season. This is not folk magic. This is biochemistry that existed in agricultural literature long before Monsanto filed its first patent. And today we are going to go through all of it. The history they buried, the science they ignored, and the exact method you can execute in your backyard before this video ends. Stay with me, because what comes next will completely change how you think about what your soil actually needs. Let's talk about who benefits from you not knowing this. The global fertilizer market was valued at $197 billion in 2022, according to Grandview Research, and it is projected to exceed $230 billion by 2030. That is not an industry. That is an empire. And like every empire, it survives by controlling what the population believes is necessary for survival. Walk into any gardening store today, and you will find an entire wall dedicated to specialty chili fertilizers. Products with names engineered to sound scientific, priced anywhere from $15 to $60 per bottle, promising explosive yields and maximum heat units. The active ingredient in many of them that actually matters for chili development? Sulfur. The same sulfur that has been sitting in a matchbox in your kitchen drawer this entire time, priced at roughly 200 Vietnamese dong per stick, or about 1 US cent. One commercial sulfur-based chili booster retails for $24.99 for 500 ml. A box of 40 matchsticks costs less than $0.50. The math is not complicated. The concealment of that math, however, is a $107 billion operation. This is how it works. After World War II, the petrochemical industry needed a new market for its surplus nitrogen and phosphate compounds. Between 1950 and 1970, agricultural extension programs across Asia, Latin America, and Africa were systematically restructured, many with direct funding from chemical corporations, to train a new generation of farmers to depend on packaged inputs. Traditional low-cost methods, including elemental sulfur applications, were quietly phased out of curricula. Not banned, not disproven, simply removed. According to a 2019 review published in the journal Agronomy, sulfur deficiency is now one of the most underdiagnosed nutrient problems in smallholder agriculture globally, affecting an estimated 30% of cultivated soils worldwide. 30%. And the solution has been sitting in a matchbox this whole time. The market worth $197 billion keeps growing precisely because that number stays invisible. But here is what they never managed to erase completely: the history. And that history is older and stranger and more powerful than any of them anticipated. Sulfur and agriculture have been inseparable for at least 2,000 years. The Roman writer Pliny the Elder documented the use of sulfur dust on crops in his encyclopedic work Naturalis Historia, written around 77 AD, a text that remained one of the most referenced agricultural guides in Europe for over a millennium. Roman farmers burned sulfur around vineyards not just as a pest deterrent, but because they observed empirically that the soil around treated plants produced more vigorous growth and more intensely flavored fruit. They did not have the vocabulary of soil chemistry, but they had eyes and they had generations of accumulated observation. Fast forward to the Mediterranean agricultural traditions of the 16th and 17th centuries, where smallholder farmers across southern Italy, Greece, and the Levant regularly worked elemental sulfur directly into beds growing peppers, eggplants, and tomatoes, all members of the same nightshade family as chili. These were not experimental plots. This was standard practice, passed between families the way recipes are passed, embedded in the practical knowledge of people who could not afford to get the harvest wrong. Then came the Green Revolution. Between 1950 and 1970, international agricultural programs, many backed by the Rockefeller Foundation and later institutionalized through the FAO, standardized farming curricula across the developing world around nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium inputs, the now famous NPK formula. It was not entirely without merit, but in that standardization, centuries of localized sulfur knowledge were reclassified as unscientific folklore and stripped from formal training. A 2003 paper in the European Journal of Agronomy noted that sulfur was largely absent from mainstream fertilization recommendations until the late 1990s, when atmospheric sulfur deposition from industrial pollution, which had been accidentally supplementing crops for decades, began to decline. The knowledge did not die, it just went underground. And it survived in exactly the places where people still trusted their grandmothers more than a government pamphlet. Now let us get into the mechanism, because this is where the story stops being interesting and starts being undeniable. A standard matchstick head contains approximately 35% sulfur by mass, along with potassium chlorate as an oxidizer and a small quantity of phosphorus, sesquisulfide, as the ignition compound. When you push an unlit matchstick into moist soil, none of that combusts. Instead, soil moisture and microbial activity begin a slow oxidation process that converts the elemental sulfur into sulfate ions, specifically SO42, the exact ionic form that plant roots are biologically equipped to absorb. This is not a shortcut or a hack. This is the normal sulfur cycle that healthy soil is supposed to perform, just being initiated from a concentrated point source rather than distributed atmospheric deposition or decomposing organic matter. The United States Department of Agriculture published guidelines as far back as 1998, acknowledging that elemental sulfur applications to soil produce measurable acidification within a 5 to 10 centimeter radius of application, with full sulfate conversion typically occurring within 2 to 4 weeks, depending on soil temperature and microbial populations. That localized acidification is critical for chili plants specifically. Capsicum species, the botanical family that includes every variety of chili from bell peppers to ghost peppers, perform optimally in soil with a pH between 6.0 and 6.8. Most garden soils trend alkaline over time, particularly in urban environments where concrete runoff and tap water irrigation push pH above 7.2. A slightly acidic microzone around the root system is not just preferable for chili. It is the condition under which the plant's nutrient uptake enzymes operate at peak efficiency, meaning iron, manganese, and zinc, all critical for fruit development, become significantly more bioavailable. But the effect that matters most for chili growers is what happens upstream of all of that. Sulfur is a direct precursor in the biosynthetic pathway that produces capsaicin. A 2010 study published in the Journal of Agricultural and Food Chemistry identified that sulfur availability influences the expression of capsaicin synthase enzymes in Capsicum annuum, the most widely cultivated chili species in the world. In practical terms, a chili plant with adequate sulfur does not just grow better. It produces measurably hotter fruit, with some experimental plots showing capsaicin concentration increases of up to 20% compared to sulfur-deficient controls. 20% hotter from Matchsticks, and we have not even talked about the phosphorus yet. The phosphorus component is quieter but equally consequential. The ignition compound in a standard matchstick head contains phosphorus sesquisulfide, P4S3, which under soil conditions breaks down gradually, releasing both phosphate and additional sulfur into the surrounding matrix. Phosphorus in its plant-available form, HPO42, is the element responsible for root architecture, energy transfer within the plant, and critically, flower-to-fruit conversion rate. A chili plant that sets more flowers but drops them before fruiting is almost always signaling a phosphorus deficiency at the root zone. The slow-release mechanism of matchstick decomposition means that phosphate becomes available precisely during the weeks when a developing chili plant needs it most. The transition from vegetative growth into reproductive phase, which typically occurs 4 to 6 weeks after transplanting. A 2017 meta-analysis published in Plant and Soil reviewed 120 field studies across tropical and subtropical growing regions and found that localized phosphorus microdosing, delivering small, concentrated amounts directly into the root zone rather than broadcasting across the entire bed, improved phosphorus use efficiency by an average of 34% compared to conventional surface application. What a matchstick does, structurally, is exactly that. It is a micro-dose delivery system that costs essentially nothing. Now, before this starts sounding like a miracle cure, let me be direct with you about something. This method has real limitations. It works most effectively in soils that already have reasonable organic matter and active microbial communities, because the sulfur oxidation process depends on bacteria, specifically thiobacillus species, that may be depleted in heavily compacted or chemically treated soils. In sterile or severely degraded soil, the conversion rate slows dramatically and the benefit diminishes. This is not a replacement for building soil health over time. It is an amplifier for soil that is already alive. And here's the thing that changes everything once you understand it. You are not a consumer in this system. You never were. You are a farmer. Every person who has ever grown food, from the Roman vineyard workers rubbing sulfur into the earth to the grandmothers in the Mekong Delta curing chili roots with matchsticks, was operating from the same fundamental position. The knowledge belongs to the grower, not the company. The moment you push a matchstick into your soil, you are not doing a gardening trick. You are reclaiming something that was taken from you without your permission. What comes next is exactly how to do it correctly, because the details matter more than you think. This is the part that actually matters, so pay close attention to every detail, because the difference between results and disappointment comes down to execution. The method is simple, but the precision is what separates a 20% yield improvement from a plant that just sits there looking confused. Start with the matchsticks themselves. You need standard safety matchsticks, the kind with a red or dark orange head, not the long fireplace matches, and absolutely not the strike anywhere variety. The chemical composition matters here. Safety matchsticks manufactured to standard specifications contain approximately 35% sulfur and a phosphorus sesquisulfide ignition compound, which is exactly what you want. Strike Anywhere matches use a different phosphorus formulation that introduces additional compounds not suited for soil application. A standard box of safety matchsticks containing 40 to 50 sticks costs between 2,000 and 5,000 Vietnamese dong at any local market, less than 0.25 USD, which means you can treat an entire garden bed for less than the cost of a single application of commercial chili fertilizer retailing at $15 to $60 per bottle. The application itself begins before you plant, or at the earliest stage of establishment if your chilies are already in the ground. Take 3 to 4 matchsticks per plant, unlit, completely unburned, and push them head down into the soil at a depth of approximately 3 to 5 centimeters. The head of the matchstick, which carries the sulfur and phosphorus compounds, must be facing downward and sitting within the active root zone. Position each stick at a radial distance of roughly 5 centimeters from the base of the stem, spacing them evenly around the plant like compass points. You are creating a slow-release ring of sulfur and phosphate that will dissolve outward as the plant's root system expands toward it over the following weeks. Timing is everything. The optimal window for application is either at transplanting, when you place the seedling into its final position, or during the early vegetative stage, when the plant has been in the ground no longer than 2 weeks. Applications made after the plant has already begun flowering will still provide some benefit, but the critical window for influencing capsaicin biosynthesis and root phosphorus uptake occurs during the first 4 to 6 weeks of establishment. If your plant is already mature and fruiting, hold this method for the next growing cycle and apply it correctly from the start. Water the plant normally after application. Do not overwater in the first week, as excessive moisture can accelerate sulfur oxidation faster than the microbial community can process it efficiently, temporarily dropping local pH below the optimal range. Normal irrigation, enough to keep the top 5 centimeters of soil consistently moist but not saturated, maintains the conversion rate within the ideal window. Watch the plant over the following 3 to 4 weeks. The first indicator that the method is working is not dramatic. It is a deepening of leaf color toward a richer, darker green. A visual signal that iron and manganese uptake has improved as a direct result of the pH adjustment in the root zone. By week 6, you should see denser branching and a noticeably higher flower set compared to untreated plants in the same bed. The heat level difference in the fruit will not be detectable until harvest, but when you bite into that first chili and your eyes water faster than usual, you will know exactly why. One application per growing season is sufficient for most soil types. In soils that test above pH 7.5, a second application at week 6 can be justified, but do not exceed 8 matchsticks total per plant per season, as sustained over-acidification of the microzone can begin to inhibit the same microbial activity you're trying to support. This knowledge costs you nothing today. What you do with it is the only question that remains. If you made it this far, you already know something that most people scrolling through gardening content will never find out. Not because it is hidden behind a paywall or locked inside a university database, but because a $197 billion industry has spent decades making sure the algorithm buries it under sponsored content and affiliate links, pointing back to products you do not need. Sharing this video is not a favor to this channel. It is an act of information retrieval. Every person you send this to is someone who gets to stop paying $24.99 for a bottle of sulfur that has been sitting in their kitchen drawer this entire time. That is what this is about, not views, not subscriptions. The knowledge survives because people who understand its value refuse to let it disappear again. If you want to be notified when the next piece of buried agricultural science surfaces here, subscribing is how you make sure the algorithm cannot quietly remove you from the conversation. That is not a call to support a channel. That is how you stay inside a network of people who have decided that food sovereignty is worth more than convenience. Try the matchstick method on your next chili planting. Document what happens at week 3, week 6, and harvest. Then come back and tell us what you found, because the most powerful database of this knowledge is not a research journal. It is the collective observation of growers who tested it themselves and reported honestly. The system only works if we keep feeding it back to each other. And in the next video, we are going into something even more uncomfortable. The reason why the nitrogen fertilizer you were told is essential for leafy greens may actually be suppressing the very compounds that make those greens worth eating in the first place. That one has a paper trail going back to 1972, and it leads somewhere nobody in the industry wants you to follow.